The much criticized and heavily condemned third season of Euphoria has finally come to an end. The finale dropped a couple of days ago, and with it, the series is officially wrapped up for good. Now, I obviously have a lot of thoughts about the final episode and the season as a whole, which I'll get into in a minute, but before that, I want to talk about the ending of the series itself. Honestly, I don't think this comes as a shock to anyone who has been keeping up with the news surrounding the show. In many ways, this feels like the right place for it to end. Because if you've been watching this season, then you already know that the show has been basically limping towards the finish line for weeks now. So, as strange as it may sound, I'm actually glad it's over. With that being said, there's a lot to unpack here, not just about the finale, but about season 3 in particular and what Euphoria ultimately leaves behind as a television series. But before we move forward, please press the like button and subscribe to the channel for more of these videos in the future. Believe me, it helps the channel more than you think. With that out of the way, let's just get into it. Now, obviously, this goes without saying that Euphoria has never exactly been a stranger to criticism. The show has always been accused of being overly explicit, overly stylized, and sometimes more interested in shock value than substance. And while I think some of that criticism has always been valid to a certain extent, this season has been a completely different problem. Season 3 is such a hollow mess that even the style isn't doing the heavy lifting anymore. I had a lot of thoughts about when the first episode premiered, and over the past 8 weeks, I've been trying to make sense of what exactly this season was trying to do. But now that it's finally over, I think my biggest takeaway is that it genuinely feels like an entirely different show. If you were to separate the first two seasons from this one, I honestly think they'd feel like completely different television series. Now, I understand that there's been a 5-year time jump. I understand that people change and circumstances change. But the issue, I think, isn't simply that the story has changed or the environment feels different. The real problem is that these characters we have spent 2 seasons following barely seem to exist anymore. These don't feel like natural evolutions of the same people. They feel like entirely new characters wearing the faces of people we have already met. The emotional connections, relationships, their motivations, and conflicts that once defined the show have either been abandoned, rewritten, or pushed so far into the background that they hardly matter anymore. It feels less like a continuation of an already established story and more like a strange epilogue written for a completely different series. The characters have so drastically changed this season that they barely feel present in the story anymore. So I'm gonna go through each one of them one by one. Let's start with Nate. I've already made an entire video about Nate Jacobs and how season 3 completely undermines the narrative and emotional arc that has been built for him over the past 2 seasons. So if you want my detailed thoughts, you can go check out the video down in the link below. But briefly speaking about Nate Jacobs, if written with a clear understanding of who he was and what he represented, could have become one of the most compelling characters on television. Instead, this season seems completely uninterested in exploring any of that. With the limited screen time that he's given, it's difficult to even understand what purpose he serves in the story anymore. His arc feels incomplete, directionless, and at times almost contradictory to everything that came before. It's not a disappointing conclusion so much as it is a complete narrative mess. Cassie and Maddy, strangely enough, have one of the more compelling storylines this season, at least in theory. Like many of Season 3's ideas, their arc starts with genuine potential before slowly falling apart with each passing episode. There was a fascinating story buried somewhere in there, two deeply flawed people forever chasing the same ghosts, constantly finding their way back into each other's orbit despite all the damage and carnage they have caused each other. Rather than confronting their flaws and genuinely growing from them, they remain trapped in an endless cycle, repeating the same mistakes over and over again. It's a story about trauma, self destruction, and emotional dependency, and for a while it almost works. Just when it feels like the story is building towards something meaningful, it either rushes through the emotional beats or abandons them entirely. By the end, what could have been one of the season's strongest arcs ends up feeling just as underdeveloped as everything else around it. Then there's Jules, or at least what remains of Jules. For a character who was once positioned as one of the emotional pillars of Euphoria, it's honestly shocking how little she has to do this season. Jules isn't given an arc, a meaningful conflict, or even enough screen time to justify her presence in the story. She simply drifts in and out of episodes, occasionally reminding the audience that she still exists before disappearing again. And unfortunately, she's not the only character who suffers from this problem. Lexi might be the biggest victim of this. I genuinely struggle to understand why Lexi is even here. For most of the season, she feels less like a character and more like a spectator watching events unfold from the sidelines. She's given very little to do, very little to say, and even less to contribute to the larger story. And I think that points to a much larger issue with season 3. The show spends so much time introducing and developing side characters that it completely neglects the people who have actually spent years investing in. Entire episodes feel dedicated to characters who, while occasionally interesting, never justify the amount of attention that they're given. It's one of the strangest decisions the season makes. Instead of deepening the stories of Rue, Jules, Nate, Cassie, Maddy, or Lexi, the show constantly shifts its focus elsewhere. As a result, almost every major character feels underdeveloped, unfinished, or abandoned. Which brings me to Rue, because despite all of my issues with this season, Rue has always been the emotional core of Euphoria, and that's exactly why her ending is so heartbreaking. For 3 seasons, Rue's story has always been about survival through addiction, grief, self destruction, and everything in between. No matter how many mistakes she made, there was always this hope that one day she would finally find peace, and that's exactly what makes her death so devastating. Not because it's shocking, but because it feels like the end of someone who spent an entire life fighting a battle she could never truly escape. And while I don't think that season 3 does enough to earn many of its emotional moments, Rue's ending is one that has genuinely stayed with me. Because at the end of the day, Euphoria was always Rue's story, and watching her die feels like watching the last bit of hope disappear with her. Now, I know a lot of people have their doubts and concerns about the finale and this season as a whole, and honestly, I understand where they're coming from. But truth be told, I do think that the final episode manages to deliver a lot of emotional weight that had been missing throughout most of this season. Do I wish that the finale was more satisfying? Do I wish these characters were given conclusions with a little more grace, care, and attention? Of course I do. But at a certain point, that's just wishing for a different season entirely. I know a lot of people have a genuine disdain for this final season and are glad that the show is finally over, but for all of its flaws, I still found it enjoyable. A frustrating experience, absolutely, a mind numbingly stupid experience at times, without a question, but an enjoyable one nonetheless. And as for Euphoria, I think what I'll miss most is that first season. There's something so optimistic about looking back at it now. It felt like the beginning of something special. There were so many possibilities, so many directions these characters could have gone in, and so many stories left waiting to be told. Unfortunately, a lot of these stories were abandoned, a lot of these characters were left behind, and a lot of genuinely talented actors were never really given the material that they actually deserved. But this is where we ended up. And while I don't think that season 3 is good, let alone great, what I will say is that the performances never stop carrying the show. From Zendaya to Jacob Elordi, from Coleman Domingo to Hunter Schafer and Sydney Sweeney, everyone brings a level of commitment and emotional honesty that often exceeds the material that they're given. The problem really is in the acting, the problem is that the writing never quite rises to meet it. And in many ways, that's probably the perfect way to describe season 3 as a whole, a collection of talented actors giving everything that they have to a story that never quite figures out what it wants to be. Anyways, that's it from my side. Let me know what you think of this third season. Did you find it lackluster and hollow, or were you happy with the conclusion? Down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Believe me, it genuinely helps the channel in the longer run. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.